Good morning. Thanks for joining us for our first virtual meetup of the year. My name is Neil Simpson, and I'm the founder of a business process automation consultancy called InnoVelocity. In our industry, we're seeing an explosion of new ideas, technologies, and buzzwords. And depending on who you ask, you might hear fuzzy or conflicting answers about what they actually mean. So in this meetup, we're going to spend a little time trying to demystify them and talk about the implications for your own needs and projects. But first, just a brief background about us. Our firm specializes in the topic of today's discussion, whether you call it digital process automation, business process management, hyperautomation, or something else. We've delivered process improvement and automation projects with a wide variety of tools and technologies, and in a variety of different verticals. And our focus is a little different from most, in that we're not usually hired by an IT group. More often than not, we're actually brought in by operational business leadership, usually to help them figure out how to apply technology to advance a particular business objective. And we think that gives us a slightly different perspective, perhaps, from some vendors who might only be trying to sell specific products or a vision of the digital enterprise in the abstract. This is a field that's been growing rapidly recently. Growing numbers of companies are convinced that they need to automate more to remain competitive, whether it's to improve customer experience, reduce cost and cycle times, or improve responsiveness and adaptability to change. Recently, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's an extra element where companies are trying to enable more efficient and coordinated remote work with these types of tools as well. Within the next 2 years, Gartner predicts that 72% of organizations will be working with one of the technologies we're talking about today, robotic process automation, or RPA. And additionally, the digital process automation market, another technology we'll talk about, is already worth 6.76 billion, according to Think Automation. So there's a bit of a Wild West field in the industry at the moment, with lots of new concepts, terms, and buzzwords to get to grips with. And most of the concepts that have caught fire have come from vendors or from the top 3 analyst firms. Robotic process automation, for instance, was coined by a vendor called Blue Prism originally. Digital process automation comes from Forrester, and there's a couple of different variations of that, deep versus wide. IDC, another analyst firm, has introduced a concept called intelligent process automation, and Gartner has IBPM or IBPMS and hyperautomation as part of the concepts that they're putting out there. So why don't we break these down a little bit, starting with digital process automation. The way that we think about digital process automation is as something that creates a digital backbone for your operations centered around a business process. And we really view this as a foundational element around which other technologies can be built. First and foremost, there is a business process or workflow component where the digital process automation platform can enhance the flow and the tracking of work between different participants, standardizing a process that you've optimized with Lean or Six Sigma, building in the best practices and putting them on rails, making sure that the work moves with things like visibility and reminders, providing automation and business rules to further enhance the quality, the speed, and the integrity of the work that's going through the process. There's also an aspect of coordination to these tools, the ability to have silo systems that don't talk to one another become integrated with something called API orchestration, replacing what I commonly refer to as swivel chair integration, where someone is taking information from one system, swiveling around and inputting it into another. These types of DPA or digital process automation platforms make it possible to send information from one system to the other using their APIs. There's also a strong analytics component typically to DPA, where an automated audit trail of every action and decision is being captured with fine-grained measurements to manage workload and identify bottlenecks. This type of technology you see frequently deployed for any kind of approval process, of course, We see a lot of employee, customer, and supplier onboarding and offboarding. We see a lot of contracts management, issue management and resolution, and so on. Really, it's a great fit for anything that has lots of processing steps for stakeholders, a long throughput time, and a risk associated with errors or mistakes. Now, some of you who have been in the industry for a while might be thinking that this sounds a little bit like ERP or business process management, and you would be right to a large extent, because there has been an evolution over the past few decades to get us to digital process automation, starting with enterprise applications like SAP back in the 1980s that standardized core processes like purchasing with best practices into a single software suite with the idea of providing efficiency and an ability to scale. In the late 1990s, BPM, or business process management, came on the scene, partially in response to some of the perceived inflexibility with ERP, where instead of adopting a standard process and centralizing it in one system, with BPM you could design your own business processes and use the orchestration capabilities to provide a common user interface and common control over multiple systems. The term digital process automation really only came to the forefront relatively recently in the 2010s, and it frequently refers to an evolution of BPM with more emphasis on low-code capabilities and wider implementation. For the most part, though, all DPA solutions have the same three key elements. The first one is some kind of process modeler that's used by process analysts, your Six Sigma or your Lean guys, to define the ideal sequence of steps, the performers, the logic of a process, something kind of similar to this very simple flowchart here that we see to the right-hand side. That diagram is then handed off to a developer who uses a studio type of product or a designer type of product to import that process map and use tools and wizards to layer on automation features like point and click, drag and drop form design, or built-in connectors to be able to call widely adopted and used information systems. That is then deployed to an engine that will run the application, allow users to interact with it through a web portal or a mobile device, for example, and collect all of the performance improvement data, which again can be given back to your process analysts to identify changes in the business process that could result in another cycle of development, release, and improvement. With the advent of digital process automation terminology, Forrester also added a characterization as to whether the platform supports what they call deep or wide adoption, so that different vendors or technology platforms can be placed on this continuum. The key message is that some platforms are designed primarily for developers. They're powerful, limitlessly customizable, but they require coding skills to use, whereas others are designed primarily for business users with lots of wizards and point and click, but because of this nature, they lack sophistication for complex needs. What we've seen in practice, though, is that many vendors are tying themselves into knots, trying to position themselves as the deepest of the wide or the widest of the deep. And we're also seeing that feature sets are converging so that lower code tools are adding sophistication and higher code tool sets are adding wizards. So despite that convergence, it's still important to understand the strengths and the technical requirements of a platform and match it to your vision about how you are going to deploy it and to whom. Forrester publishes something they call a wave that plots different vendors on this scale. But beyond that, we always recommend, and we can actually help customers as well, to dig a little bit deeper and analyze the platforms against their own specific operational and technical requirements. So what about robotic process automation? This is an area right now where there's a lot of attention. And the way that I like to simplify and talk about what RPA is it's basically a piece of software that can run application software in the same way as a human, replacing repetitive tasks that a single person might be doing as opposed to a workflow automation or a digital process automation, which is coordinating the work of multiple people. More often than not, RPA also includes business rules that can help to make decisions and handle exceptions so that human beings don't have to step in and get involved. And it's been very interesting seeing the evolution of this technology as well. Again, back in the 1990s, software like this did exist to some extent, but they were called screen scrapers. And the idea was that these were tools that could extract data from the web or from applications using their presentation layer. There was also a classification of tools around about the same time called workflow automation, but more workflow in terms of automating programmable steps on a user's desktop in a repeatable way. And the real genius of RPA is basically combining these two things along with additional OCR, optical character recognition, machine learning, other types of integration capabilities to give you a tool set that will allow you to automate a wide range of manual repeatable work. And commonly we see these tools used for things like data migration and data entry, high transaction loads like invoice processing. A lot of times we also see it as a form of system integration in lieu of an API. If you have some kind of legacy tool that doesn't provide an interface, you can move information from one system to another using a robot through the UI of your target system. But really for RPA, you'd be looking at anything that's highly manual and repetitive, anything that has high volumes and fairly predictable and rule-based. Like a DPA platform, RPA has a designer for someone to build their robot, either by recording screen interactions or in more technical ways. And those robots are deployed to something like a conductor that will manage their scheduling, deployment, and monitoring. And there are two different flavors of robot. There's something called an unattended robot that runs by itself on a schedule without human intervention, which is great for large-scale batch processing types of operations. And then you also have an attended robot concept, which actually runs as another piece of software on a user's desktop, and it runs at their instruction, which is better for more complex or ambiguous tasks. The next frontier for these technologies involves what a lot of vendors and analysts are calling artificial intelligence. And the classifications that are put out there are intelligent and hyperautomation by the different analyst firms. But it all really got started back around 2012 with Gartner, who coined the term IBPMS, really before RPA took off. And the idea was that DPA platforms would be enhanced with machine learning that could be used to aid or replace human decision making. So for example, if you had within your workflow or your business process a human decision to route work one way or another based on some data that's being collected, machine learning could learn based on that person's past decisions what to do, and initially maybe offer some suggestions for the user to consider, but eventually take over the work and automate it completely. Intelligent Process Automation, or IPA, was coined by IDC more recently, and it adds RPA into the mix, as well as a broader array of artificial intelligence tools. So the idea there is that robots automate or augment the work that's happening during individual steps of an automated process, and AI learning capability is used either by RPA or DPA to make decisions. And under the category of AI here, we find a little bit of expansion where IPA refers to chatbots very frequently and natural language processing as ways to enhance processes that involve customer interactions. Hyperautomation is Gartner's spin on this concept, but with a much wider focus. Critically, it adds in a concept of digital operations as an integral component, or digital ops. And we've often seen this realized as a specialist team or division that works alongside traditional business operations and IT, but is responsible for bringing all these types of DPA, RPA, and AI tools in, optimizing them, and maintaining them. So in summary, we've covered a lot of terms here, put it all on one page. You have digital process automation, or DPA, and intelligent business process management, IBPM or BPM. And these are concerned with automation of workflow and orchestration of systems, with deep DPA being concerned with highly customizable, code-driven, more used for developers, wide being easier to use, simpler use cases. Robotic process automation is automation of repetitive manual tasks performed through a UI. Artificial intelligence, in this case, it's a very broad term, but in this case it refers to things like pattern recognition and recommendations using machine learning and natural language processing, internal and external customer service interaction with chatbots, unstructured document processing with computer vision, among other things. And then you have IPA, which combines all three of these into a complete solution for your enterprise, along with hyperautomation, which is similar to IPA but more holistic in nature and geared towards large-scale enterprise adoption. So with all this, it can seem overwhelming to know where to start. Our first recommendation is to set goals, objectives, and a focus. These tools are really a means to an end and not an end in themselves. So you should start with a clear picture of what success looks like for your enterprise, and then select the technology mix to match. Is your goal cost reduction, customer retention, revenue growth, and so on? How will the improvement be measured, and how will you know if you're successful? You should really consider creating that baseline to understand your organization's current performance, pain areas, and to identify and document the specific processes where the tools will be applied. This is also a great time to make sure you understand the capabilities of your development team and where you might need to bring in outside help. Secondly, we recommend setting up clear governance roles and responsibilities. Usually, this could be realized with a digital operations group or a center of excellence that is clearly aligned to operational improvement groups and existing IT groups. Otherwise, you could find some challenges. We like to recommend that the government models that you set up keep discrete technologies within their own lanes and provide clarity about which are being used where in the business and why. And thirdly, we recommend before you get started that you establish and use technical standards and make that part of your selection process. Taking a standard-based approach to the technology investment so that you can benefit from consistent architectures and training methods, among other benefits. You should really be looking for tools and vendors that support industry standards like Business Process Modeling Notation or BPMN, Decision Model Notation, DMN, technology stacks like Java, and so on. So with that, we'll move on to the group discussion, where we'll open it up and get your feedback. And some ideas for discussion here are whether or not you've been investigating these tools, terms, and technologies, what you think the impact could be to your project or your organization, and what still confuses you about some of these terms and concepts.